Dear panelists, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you today to our panel discussion on Indigenous women and climate change, an event that we are hosting in the context of the 66th session of the UN Commission on the Status of Women. When we talk about Indigenous communities, we talk about approximately 476.6 million people worldwide. They are custodians of 80% of the biodiversity in the world and are directly affected by climate change, but also by mitigation and adaptation measures. Indigenous knowledge that could contribute to climate resilience is often not taken into consideration, as Indigenous communities lack representation, platforms for communication, and they are often excluded from political decision-making processes. And Indigenous women are facing double challenges by climate change, as women as well as members of Indigenous communities. The Office of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in New York has taken up this topic, as we are not only advocates for women's rights, but we also seek to enhance the political participation of Indigenous communities. In Latin America, CAS runs for over 10 years now the transnational program Participación Política Indígena, and it is my pleasure also to welcome my colleague and also the program director, Dr. Christina Stolte, to our round today. In our discussion, we particularly would like to address not only the challenges women in Indigenous communities in the context of climate change face, but we also want to seek how better policies and their effective implementation could address environmental injustices, increased levels of poverty, and gender inequality. And the experts lined up for today's discussion could not be better placed. It is my pleasure to introduce to you the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous People, Francisco Cali Tzay. Ambassador Kalissai, a Maya Cachiquel from Guatemala, has been a founder and member of different Indigenous organizations in Guatemala and served as well as an ambassador of Guatemala to Germany. He was as well for 16 years president of the UN Committee for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, a treaty body of the UN. In Guatemala, also Francisco Cali Tzay served as Director of Human Rights at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and as a member of the Presidential Commission Against Discrimination and Racism against Indigenous Peoples in Guatemala. Inter alia, he was also president of the National Reparation Program for Victims of the Internal Armed Conflict. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for joining us today. We also have on our panel Rose-Liza Eisma-Osorio, Professor for Environmental Law and Natural Resource Management at the University of Cebu in the Philippines. Professor Eisma-Osorio is also founder and trustee of the Philippine Earth Justice Center, a center that has also brought forward very high-level cases in the context of environmental law. Professor Eisma, you are also a collaborator of Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and particularly the rule of law programs, be it in Asia, be it in Europe. So thank you very much for joining us, and particularly also for spending your late evening with us, tuning in from the Philippines. It's much appreciated. Thank you. Also, we have with us Professor Jonathan Liljeblad from the College of Law of the Australian National University. And he joins us today from the US, where he has also lived and studied. His research largely focuses on rule of law with case studies from human rights, Indigenous rights, and also environmental issues. Also, one of his research papers relates Indigenous rights and environmental issues within the Universal Periodic Review of Human Rights. And we certainly will touch on this when we are coming back on it later in the discussion. So thank you very much, Jonathan. As I just learned, you are also a close friend of Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and particularly of our representative who's now based in Canada. And that gives me also a very good connection with Canada. And I would like to welcome Cheyenne Mckay, who is a senior project manager at the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources. The center assists First Nations to address environmental challenges. Cheyenne has 14 years of experiences in environmental conservation sciences and has spent more than 13 years working directly with First Nation communities. She's a Ojibwe and a member of the Pine Creek First Nation in Manitoba. She has, inter alia, also contributed to the development of the Indigenous Climate Change Adaptation Planning Guidance document, and has also organized and co-facilitated a national Indigenous community-based climate monitoring symposium. So thank you very much, Cheyenne, for tuning in from Canada and for being with us. And last but not least, I would like to welcome in our panel Guadalupe, Estela, Peralta, Santiago from the Zapotec community in Mexico. Guadalupe Peralta works as an independent consultant, and she's a very close cooperation partner of my colleagues who are running the program for the political participation of Indigenous communities. And we also have actually on our team, Monica from Mexico. So thank you very much for joining us. It's a great honor to have you all with us today. So we are having a kind of a loose conversation with our panelists. And I would like to invite our participants to come in with questions along the discussion that we are evolving. And I will take up the questions one by one and just weave them into the kind of conversation that we are having. So thank you very much. And let me start with Francisco Kalissai, the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous people, as you have probably the most comprehensive and global overview of the problems Indigenous communities, and particularly also women, are facing in the context of climate change. Could you please give our audience an insight into these challenges and what it means for their culture and identity as well?
Well, first of all, good morning, Andrea. Good morning to all the people who are joining us. It is a great honor and privilege to join you today and share remarks for this panel discussion on Indigenous women and climate change. I would like to congratulate Konrad Adenauer-Shinto for facilitating this virtual dialogue on the topic of paramount importance. And I look forward to hearing the contribution of my colleagues. And as you know, that the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I dedicate 2 annual thematic reports to the Human Rights Council and to the UN General Assembly. The specific situation of Indigenous peoples, especially women, will be the heart of this year report to the Human Rights Council, as it will focus on Indigenous women and development, application, preservation, and transmission of scientific knowledge. This report will recognize that Indigenous women, because of their relationship with land and natural environment and the marginalization they face for being women and Indigenous, are disproportionately affected by the loss of territory due to climate change. And the report will also recognize that Indigenous women play a vital role as a holder of scientific and technical knowledge, and that their knowledge is critical in creating solutions to address climate change and preservation and protection of biodiversity. Well, probably doesn't have to do many things with the issue, but my report to the UN General Assembly this year is also directly connected to today's dialogue in a way, as we'll focus on protected area and Indigenous people's rights. The obligation of the state and international organization to respect Indigenous people's rights. This report will review the ways in which lands and resources are removed from Indigenous people control for conservancy, climate change programs, national parks, game reserves, and cultural heritage protection, and will underline the state conservation effort are often at odds with indigenous rights to autonomy, security of land tenure, and self-determination or self-determined development, and fail to respect their specific knowledge and sustainable land practices. It is expected that this report will highlight the specific elements pertaining to the right of indigenous women and girls and the way in which they are impacted by climate change. You know that women and girls are the more affected by climate change, and also the policy that some states have been implemented to create those protected areas, because when those protected areas are created, the program is believed that doesn't have to be people living in those areas, so they are removing forcibly indigenous people from there, and who are suffering mostly and directly are women. So what I have been facing, what I have been finding in this year and a half, and of course my 16 years in CERD, is that women are more affected by those policies. And in this moment, just from 2020 to today, the environment defenders, especially women, are the ones who have been target of attacks. They have been killed, they have been captured, they have been criminalized, they have been incarcerated. So there are many issues that have been taking place against women that are working defending environment. So I will leave the time here, because I know that there are many other issues that is coming. Just to mention, very fast, is that this problem has been increased, especially in COVID-19 crisis. The violence and everything that affecting indigenous people is affecting directly women and girls. So I will leave it here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ambassador. Guadalupe, we just heard this overview and the kind of issues the UN Special Rapporteur will address in his forthcoming reports. If you look at the communities you are working with, how do those communities, and particularly the women in those communities, try to address these kind of challenges? What kind of methods of resilience have they built up? And do they have political channels where they could also raise awareness about their situation? It's good to have the reports by the UN Special Rapporteur, who are then also presented to member states. But what is also coming down into the societies?
Hola, sí, muchas gracias, Andrea. Muchas gracias. Qué gusto estar esta mañana compartiendo con tan diversas personas. Me da mucho gusto. Y bueno, yo quiero decir que efectivamente, cuando nosotros hablamos de pueblos indígenas, cuando hablamos de cómo enfrentan estos desafíos, pues muchas veces siempre escuchamos esta constante, ¿no? Son guardianes de la diversidad, son resilientes, tienen una simbiosis, una cuestión cosmogónica muy fuerte relacionada con su interacción al medio ambiente. Y eso se escucha muy bien. Y se escucha muy bien, pero yo lo que puedo mirar desde las comunidades en las que he estado, en las comunidades en las que he participado, pero también de las que otros colegas han documentado, pues es que los pueblos indígenas en general, y las mujeres indígenas en particular, pues van a enfrentar las consecuencias de todos. Y enfrentan también las consecuencias y los desafíos del cambio climático desde adentro. Y cuando hablo desde adentro me refiero con sus propios recursos, me refiero desde su sabiduría, desde su cosmovisión. Entonces, los elementos que van a poner en marcha para enfrentar estos desafíos, pues no solo depende de las afectaciones y de las consecuencias del cambio climático, ¿no? También depende obviamente de las características de esos pueblos, de la ubicación geográfica de esos pueblos, porque estarán de acuerdo conmigo en que no es lo mismo ser un país central que ser un país rodeado de mar, ¿no? Y más aún si tienes a los dos océanos por frontera, ¿no? Entonces, también lo determina las condiciones de pobreza, las condiciones de marginación en la que viven, el acceso que tienen a los recursos naturales, las necesidades que tienen y también el acceso a los puestos de toma de decisión. Y esos son elementos muy importantes. ¿Por qué? Porque así como el desarrollo no es homogéneo, tampoco son homogéneos los desafíos que tienen, ¿no? Entonces, estos desafíos, esas afectaciones van a variar, ¿no? Por estas condiciones que he mencionado, entre otras más, ¿no? Entonces, hay muchos ejemplos. Y en la constante que me he encontrado es, por ejemplo, en la agricultura, que dicen, bueno, ya las voces coinciden en que ya no se dedican al campo porque los ciclos de lluvia están desfasados en temporalidad, en intensidad, y pues muchas veces producto del cambio climático, que a veces dentro de los mismos pueblos indígenas no saben que se trata de un cambio climático, ¿no? Y no saben, ellos saben que es un desequilibrio que se causa dentro de sus elementos, dentro de su cosmovisión, dentro de sus saberes, pero esta etiqueta de cambio climático no es de ellos, ¿no? Es un nombre de fuera, podemos decir. Entonces, ya en estas comunidades, pues los adultos siembran poco y la opción que tienen los jóvenes es migrar. Generalmente es migrar, ¿no? Aquí juegan un papel muy importante tanto hombres y mujeres, y este papel, pues bueno, en este asunto las mujeres indígenas, campesinas, de espacios rurales, tenemos, es cierto, una relación intrínseca con la naturaleza, y también somos las que sentimos más los efectos del cambio climático, pero además de estar expuestas, creo que estamos en otra situación en este momento histórico, ¿no? Creo que esta situación ha cambiado un poco. Ya podemos considerar que en diferentes espacios, en diferentes sociedades indígenas, somos también agentes de cambio. Y somos agentes de cambio porque tenemos ya la capacidad, insisto, en mayor o menor medida, dependiendo de la ubicación geográfica, de asumir liderazgos. Y se han estado asumiendo porque con el paso del tiempo las mujeres indígenas, yo lo que he visto es que se han ido adaptando a las necesidades de sus comunidades y han transitado de diferentes grados de participación para dar paso para dar paso a su presencia en espacios de toma de decisiones, en consejos de vigilancias, en comités, dentro de sus comunidades, ¿no? Ahora cuentan con liderazgos que se van visibilizando dentro de las comunidades, pero en donde muchas veces, además de superar un patriarcado, están tratando de contrarrestar estas afectaciones del cambio climático y están tratando de ser ellas mismas, están tratando de sobrevivir en esas circunstancias. Entonces, todos estos elementos que se dicen de las mujeres indígenas y las discriminaciones, vuelve a replicarse con mayor intensidad, considero yo, dentro de este cambio climático, ¿no? Si ellos tienen canales políticos, sí existen. Y la sensibilización la inician, o sus canales políticos van desde el interior, ¿no? Desde el interior, a través de asambleas, a través de consejos de ancianos, consejos de mayores, o cualquier forma de organización que ellos tengan, ¿no? Auxiliares comunitarios, y desde ahí van a tratar de empezar esa sensibilización, esa concientización que para ellos es natural. Es el amor a la madre tierra, el amor a la naturaleza, y entonces van a tratar de expandirlo, traspasando límites muchas veces comunitarios, límites municipales, en la medida en que de manera regional puedan compartirse todavía estas cosmovisiones y puedan entenderse valores comunes, ¿no? también lo hacen a través de asociaciones de municipios, también lo hacen a través, en algunos países, de áreas protegidas. En caso de México, es más a través de las asambleas, a través de los municipios y a través de asociaciones de ciudadanos, ¿no? Y a nivel subnacional, pues bueno, se van construyendo y se va consolidando la capacidad de interlocución que tienen, pero posiblemente sea la carencia de representantes indígenas o la falta de una agenda para la defensa y el cuidado de los recursos naturales, lo que muchas veces le va restando importancia a este tema y le va restando importancia también a las decisiones que se toman desde la perspectiva de los estados. Y esto lo digo porque, bueno, pasa a nivel nacional, a nivel también tenemos secretarías de Estado encargadas de pueblos indígenas, encargadas de los recursos naturales, pero muchas veces pareciera que no resuena el eco de las demandas de las comunidades indígenas. Y entonces, pareciera también que falta sensibilidad política ante este tema tan importante y que, bueno, en un momento dado, no solo va a atacar o va a afectar a comunidades indígenas, sino a todas, ¿no? Entonces, aquí algunas reflexiones solamente.
Okay, thank you very much, Guadalupe. Cheyenne, we just heard from Guadalupe the kind of double challenges women are facing. You and the Center assist First Nations in Canada in building capacity to particularly address the environmental issues. What are the most pressing needs, particularly of women, that you can identify? And can you also notify that these kind of needs have changed over the last decade? And in your work, to what extent do you have support and cooperation by the state? Because we just heard also from Guadalupe that there is a lack of political awareness about the situation as well.
Yes, thank you. I think when we talk about what are the impacts, it goes down to that Canada has a history of colonial disconnect when it comes to Indigenous peoples. There's over 600 communities, and I'm a generational residential school survivor. My grandmother attended residential school, my mother attended. I am not fluent in my language, and I didn't understand my culture or my identity really until I was an adult. So in giving this, that was a huge barrier when it came down to getting educated, especially in the STEM education, the science and the technology, engineering and the math. I really struggled with that because there's a disparity that exists when it comes to our education system in Canada. When I left my reserve, I was an A student, but when I went to high school and further education, I struggled. And I had to take different types of education training programs to become better. And I think if we want to be leaders of today, we need to support our leaders of tomorrow. So given the challenges that I faced, I feel that that's a huge barrier, is the level of support that we give to our women and girls and two-spirit individuals to make it inclusive. The transition that they have from when they leave their communities, it's a huge cultural shock. You leave everything that you know and you go from like 50 people to 5,000. Given the extra supports, if I had had that, I think it would have been an easier transition to understand the science and the mathematical aspects that I needed, as well as to be more balanced in terms of culture and language and ceremony and my identity. And also following post-secondary education, there was also no supports to kind of guide me into the employment workforce. So I feel that if we want to be leaders of today, we need to support the future climate changers that exist in our Indigenous communities. And how we do that is by restoring our cultural roles. And in my culture, for being an Ojibwe woman, we are caretakers of the water, because we're all made of water. Water gives everybody life. That's how you start your life, is being born from water. It's in 99% of our body is made of water. It's really ingrained into everything we do. We could not survive without water. So we all need to take care of water. And in that context, I think there needs to be more education and training, but a combination of land-based cultural training, but also the science aspect of training and how to restore that relationship, that sacred relationship to water, and to be a water carrier with that knowledge. And also to build in those and education programs and the post-education programs for more education, training, mentorship opportunities. I feel if I had that, I may have had like an easier start, but it took me having to learn, stumbling as I went along over the last 12 years, working with my organization on how best to support other people and trying to gain the knowledge and the capacity. Because I feel that if women and young girls and two-spirited individuals really want to make a change in their community and deal with these climate effects of flooding, fires, drought situations in agriculture, a decreased winter road situation, you need to understand the science behind it, but also the cultural and traditional knowledge that comes with that. So they're intertwined. And we say that as like a two-eyed seeing approach, where you're looking at one eye with science and one eye with culture, but together you're seeing a pathway forward. So I think it's really important in that aspect. And your second question on how does the government support us better, that there needs to be more, as Guadalupe said, there needs to be more roles for women, two-spirited and girls, and especially in the mentorship and getting to those decision-making positions, whether that be Indigenous representation on boards or executive directors, expert panels, advisory panels, selection committees, researchers, especially having the Indigenous researchers be built into policy, I think is huge and monumental. I also sit as an advisory panel member for the Canadian Institute of Climate Choices. So that's one of the projects that we're doing is Indigenous perspectives of climate change and getting the Indigenous researchers to tell their story. And majority of our researchers are women. So it's just really, we need to create these opportunities for growth and for learning and for understanding, but restoring those sacred relationships. We need to go back to the laws of nature. There's over 600 communities, multiple cultures, diverse languages. So it's an individual approach, like a community approach, and how the community looks after the child. We didn't rely on what we have today with technology to help care for our children, to put them in front of technology. We worked together and we helped each other, we supported, we grew food as a collective, we went hunting as a collective and shared what we had. And we didn't take any more than what we needed. And those kind of teachings need to be brought to our young children, and they're watching us, and the whole world is watching us, and we need to be the example for them to follow. For the Ojibwe, the sacred teaching that comes to mind for me is turtle, which is truth. So we have 7 sacred laws of teaching in Ojibwe, but that one stands out to me because it's the truth. We need to understand where we came from, where we're at right now, and where are we headed. And are we doing that together? We need to work together. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cheyenne, also for sharing your personal story and for drawing attention what it actually means also for the education and how traditional and science-based knowledge can be, can be a kind of a fusion of the two cultures in order to address the challenges of climate change. Now, thank you very much, particularly also for the personal part of your input. Professor Eisma-Osorio, you are a founder of the Earth and Justice Center in the Philippines, and the center provides capacity building on environmental issues and renders legal defense and counseling also to communities. And you have done this also for the last 20 years. If you look at the landscape of organizations and also advocacy groups working on Indigenous rights and also on the climate and environmental issues, would you say that there is sufficient cooperation, or do they run on parallel tracks and remain in their respective silos? Because I'm working mainly in the development field, and the kind of the silo mentality, although we are always addressing it, we haven't managed to break it up. So how do you see the situation when it comes to Indigenous rights, women's rights, and environmental issues?
Yes, I could say that there is some sort of cooperation, but if this cooperation is sufficient, I would say no. yeah, we recognize that we are working on respective silos, focusing on specific issues and advocacies. But then there would be times that, you know, there would be intersectionality of our advocacies, you know, and however, you know, we still run on, you know, parallel tracks most of the time, and remain in our respective silos. But in my mind, you know, efforts to provide assistance to marginalized communities must be done collaboratively among these groups. Of course, the work of looking after indigenous communities, you know, especially providing with them with legal defense and counseling, especially to women and other marginalized groups, can be, you know, given more, should be given more attention. In the Philippines, you know, where I've worked for the last 20 or so years, you know, this legal public law interest groups have created a network, you know, where we share our learning platforms. We do collaborative work with our different minority groups. We try to improve their knowledge and capacity to deal with human rights issues. However, you know, sometimes, you know, because of there's so few organizations that are also focusing on that, and few public interest law groups as well in the country, it's not enough for, you know, a population of 110 million, when you have only about 10 or so, or less than 20 public law interest groups focusing on a developmental law, and the resources are limited. My realization that it's, you know, this problems that we are facing with, especially with looking after indigenous communities, should not be, you know, left alone, left with non-government organizations alone. Government must step in as well. While we do have a national law, the Indigenous Peoples Rights Act in the Philippines, that promotes and protects the rights of indigenous cultural communities, and especially to ensure their economic, social, and cultural well-being. And there are institutional mechanisms put in place, like the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples. We need to give more life to this legal and institutional framework. And also, to do so, we have to address what are the root causes, the problem of inequality and social injustice on the ground. There's still massive evidence of environmental changes and exposure of these communities, a combination of natural disasters. You know, Philippines was visited by, you know, 20 extreme weather events, typhoons every year. There's still extreme poverty, that you know, that even, you know, when even if we have, you know, the capacity to deal with this, natural disasters and climate change, you know, poverty would also still bring back, you know, the many steps we have done in trying to uplift the conditions of our marginalized communities. So according, this brings to mind, you know, what one of our indigenous Filipino lawmaker was saying, in a conference. To say, he was saying that, you know, from an indigenous person's perspective, there's nothing neutral about the crisis, you know, the crisis, the different crises that we go through. So and it's true, you know, unfortunately, indigenous peoples are really facing serious threats in mitigating the effects of climate change in their territories, because these are now being polluted, destroyed by big business companies. They're also subjected to extrajudicial killings, red tagging, you know, whenever they try to assert their rights to manage and control their natural resources. So legal advocacy groups like the Philippine Earth Justice Center play really an important role, especially in this type of situation, to ensure accountability of government institutions, accountability of private sectors, so that, you know, that they will respect, protect, and fulfill indigenous people's collective and individual rights, and promote, you know, also the contributions of these communities in helping address some of the issues that we're facing, like climate change. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. You just heard Professor Liljeblad that, yeah, the government has to step in, and there has to be also the accountability mechanism for government and the private sector. You have particularly in your research drawn attention to the instrument of the Universal Periodic Review on Human Rights, which could be used also, this is your argument, to further protect indigenous rights in the context of climate change. Could you perhaps explain a little bit to our audience what would be necessary to have it as a kind of a strong instrument? And how do you perceive also the level of political will by member states to advance in such a direction? Because government, as we also just heard from Guadalupe and Cheyenne and Elisa, plays such a crucial part.
Thanks, Andre, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. I'll just note that I'm a member of the Pa'o Indigenous Peoples of Myanmar, and similar to Cheyenne, I have an experience of disconnect as well and of being separated from my own culture. So I think one of the themes today is about the need on an individual, but also on a very human level, to reintegrate the various complex aspects of our identities. And on a larger scale, on a global scale, this means a reconnection between indigenous and non-indigenous cultures. However, there are challenges to this. And in particular, the international system that we live in is very state-centric. It's focused on nation states. And the Universal Periodic Review mechanism is a reflection of this. So Universal Periodic Review, for the audience who doesn't know, reviews the human rights records of each member of the UN General Assembly. It's periodic because this cycle takes about 5 to 6 years at the moment. And that the review is not done by independent entities, but the review is done by peers. So Universal Periodic Review is conducted through working groups of the Human Rights Council, comprised of states. So it's states that review other states. Indigenous peoples, in my research, have accessed Universal Periodic Review through two strategies. One is that as non-state actors, they are allowed to submit reports to the Universal Periodic Review, so they can give information about the conduct of states towards indigenous peoples and indigenous rights to the Universal Periodic Review mechanism. And then the second strategy is that indigenous peoples can conduct site events at the Universal Periodic Review site in Geneva. And at the site events, they can engage directly with state parties to promote their concerns and to publicize the issues that they are facing in their respective areas. However, the thing that must be remembered is with Universal Periodic Review is that states operate the mechanism, and as a result, it is states' discretion to accept the reports of indigenous activism and also to attend the site events that are hosted by indigenous actors. There is some mitigation. I just want to caution that separate from Universal Periodic Review, indigenous peoples do have a presence in the Human Rights Council through the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples, or MRIP, and they are empowered to do things like conduct investigations, create their own reports, to give technical advice to states. But this, I'll finish with my on this issue with a comment that I'll convey from the previous rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples, James Anaya, who made a very specific point that we're at a stage right now in the international system where we need to implement indigenous rights. And the way we have to implement indigenous rights is by promoting good state practice. The international system, as reflected by Universal Periodic Review, is very state-centric, and we have to promote good habits by states to consider, to recognize, and to engage indigenous actors and indigenous voices. And this is the stage that we are on right now. So thank you.
Could you allow me just a follow-up question? If you speak about the good state practice, are there examples out there, and perhaps all the panelists could come in at that point, are there good examples of state practice where you would say, yeah, this is something one could replicate, perhaps differently, but in another context?
If you allow me.
Yes, please.
In general, we can see that some countries, they are doing a very good, or they have a very good practices. In general, I'm talking about in general. But when you go deeply and you analyze all the policies that they are implementing, you will see that they are not taking in account indigenous peoples. So they are not consulting with them. They are not having their free, prior, and informed consent. And that's why it's affecting them, especially all the measures that they are taking to control the climate change, or to not to control, but to just to fight against the climate change. Sometimes those policies, even that you can see as a positive policies, what really is affecting our indigenous peoples. And just to give you an example, that is, it is scientifically proven that there is a correlation between deforestation and zoonotic disease. In this regard, indigenous women have played a paramount role in protection of nature and the ecosystem. But the commitment that they have after 2016 on the protection of 30% of biodiversity, as far I have been seeing, is that they are not doing anything. Instead of that, they are creating ecological parks where they are removing forcibly, even using public forces, army, police, national police, to forcibly remove indigenous people from their territories. So, as I said, in general, you can see that they are doing a very good things protecting the environment. But in particularly, our indigenous people who are suffering those policies they are implementing. And it's contradictory because they are taking indigenous land, but they are forcibly removing them from that area. And as my colleague was saying earlier, it's beautiful to hear that states are taking into account the cosmovision or the worldview of indigenous peoples. But really, the indigenous people are the ones who are affected. The only we can say the only example that I can remember in this moment is something that is taking place specifically in Guadalupe's territory, in Oaxaca, the water cedars, or las sembradoras de agua, where the government recognized the right of those communities to co-manage the water that they had been able to harvest or to sieve that water. So I think that, but that is not only the government, it's the effort of indigenous people, especially women. So I think that that is what I have been seeing, and that's why always we can say my plea to the government is to help, to support those kind of projects that indigenous women are implementing in their communities.
Okay, thank you very much. Do you have more good state practices? Because this is really what we are also looking for in order to advocate for more of those kind of procedures, mechanisms, initiatives.
I have some that I'd like to share. I think Canada is doing a good job of providing opportunities for climate change and opportunities for women to become involved. They have a variety of different funds that are available to Indigenous communities in the energy sector, also environmental damages fund. So they make the polluter pay. So if there's a polluter was fined a certain amount for not following the environmental rules, they get fined, and then those fines get pooled into a fund that communities can apply for. There's also funds regarding to climate change and health, so the health impacts, which is mostly related to food sovereignty from what I've seen. Also, Environment Climate Change Canada has numerous funds available, and there's also a Native Women's Association of Canada that looks after the rights and provides different opportunities for Native women in Canada. There's also the Assembly of First Nations in Canada, which is broken up into the regions across the country. They also have climate change coordinators that are being based and spread around the country. The challenge is, though, that the Assembly of First Nations doesn't address the needs of all Indigenous communities in Canada, be it Métis, Inuit. And then for my organization, for SEER, we're really focused on boots on the ground type of community work, working on climate change adaptation planning, education, training, resources, and helping build up the capacity that may be lacking due to not having the supports and that communities have. Because in order to have successful work done in communities, you need to foster community champions. So it's always about like finding up that community champion to make the good work happen. So I think Canada is doing a good job of providing these opportunities, but what could be improved upon is having that extra step and that extra support to access these funds, whether that be report writing, proposal development, and reporting on the funds, the financial aspect. Because a lot of that time, the responsibility is on the communities to do that, and they may not have the background to do that. So they end up hiring outside consultants, and then your money is not staying in the community, it's flowing out. And we want to try and increase the capacity. So those are the kind of things that I like to focus on when we're developing projects, is how can we keep the money and the resources within the community to grow the community and not have it leave. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more inputs on that? Yes, Guadalupe. Yes.
Sí, a mí me gustaría, gracias, a mí me gustaría comentar que hay buenas prácticas desde las propias comunidades, ¿no? Porque pareciera que cuando hablamos ya a nivel nacional, ¿no? Estas buenas prácticas, como decía el relator hace un momento, pues pudiera parecer que sí se están haciendo muchas cosas, pero entran en juego nuevos actores o actores diferentes, ¿no? Entonces, actores tradicionales, nuevos actores que tienden a desdibujar, por así decirlo, un poco la razón o un poco el impacto que pudieran tener algunos proyectos, programas, etcétera. Sin embargo, a mí me gustaría reconocer y comentar que desde las comunidades, él hablaba del estado de Oaxaca, al sur de México, hay muchas buenas prácticas desde las propias comunidades, ¿no? El manejo de residuos, ¿no? A nivel local, a nivel municipal, a nivel de las mujeres, las campañas de sensibilización para el no uso de PET, no uso del nylon, ni cualquier tipo de plástico, ¿no? Desde las propias tiendas, desde la propia comunidad, desde los propios mercados o tianguis, ¿no? En nuestras comunidades. Entonces, hay también programas para rescatar especies en peligro de extinción en la parte de la Sierra Norte de Oaxaca. Hay también trabajo de mujeres desde los espacios de toma de decisión para la educación ambiental de los niños. Hay también trabajo de mujeres para el fortalecimiento de liderazgos como guardianas de los bosques. Hay mucho trabajo. En Oaxaca hay trabajo que debe ser visibilizado como buena práctica desde las propias comunidades, ¿no? Y desde las propias comunidades se han estado moviendo, se han estado organizando, han estado actuando y han generado impactos positivos, ¿no? Muchas experiencias tienen que ser visibilizadas. Las hay en otros estados del país también, pero insisto, creo que es precisamente lo que hace falta, esa visibilización de buenas prácticas que pueda conectarse con algún tipo de programa o entidad a nivel nacional y no solo a nivel nacional, sino también actores internacionales y que puedan fortalecer esos liderazgos, que puedan fortalecer esas participaciones, esas acciones y que puedan impactar en mayor medida y dar mejores resultados.
Thank you so much, Guadalupe. Jonathan, as you had specifically researched on the UPR, to what extent are Indigenous communities already making use of the possibility to report to government, or even in the context of the Agenda 2030, also to come into the voluntary national reviews with their own input?
Yeah, so I've seen, my research specifically has followed Indigenous organizations from Myanmar and also Asia as a whole, who are using the UPR as a way of addressing domestic problems. One of the features of the Human Rights Council and by extension, the Universal Periodic Review mechanism is that they recognize that human rights and environmental issues are connected, right? So they apply the work of the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment to acknowledge and to address the fact that the two issues are connected. So a human rights mechanism like the UPR is able to address environmental problems. And with the case of Indigenous peoples, especially with the examples I've seen coming from Asia, is that many environmental problems are connected to human rights problems. There are many cases of dispossession of land and water resources, and the acts of dispossession usually involve violations of human rights, violations of group rights, rights to culture, rights to society, rights to development, rights to autonomy and self-determination. It also involves violations of individual rights, rights of free speech, rights of assembly, rights of travel, rights to life. And so as a result, Indigenous peoples are able to go ahead and work through human rights mechanisms to address environmental problems. But again, the trick or the key thing that must happen with the Universal Periodic Review is that Indigenous organizations that go through the mechanisms have to recognize that they need or depend upon state actors. So they must try to find state delegates who are attending the UPR, who are sympathetic to Indigenous concerns. And they must also be very active in engaging the mechanism through the two strategies I mentioned, either submitting reports or hosting side events. Writing reports is relatively straightforward, but it does require technical expertise. Not all Indigenous communities have this, and so this is a challenge. And then attending the side events or organizing side events requires costs, because it costs a lot of money to travel to Geneva and costs a lot of money to organize and host the side events. So once again, this is one of the challenges that faces many Indigenous organizations. There are ways around this, and so we use this technical term allyship that at least a lot of the Indigenous organizations that I have studied, they come from very poor backgrounds with, and they lack the technical expertise, they lack the financial resources, they lack the awareness of international law or the United Nations, and they usually have to ally or have an alliance with a partner who can provide them with the technical expertise or the financial resources or the familiarity with the UN system. But if they are able to do that, then they are then able to gain some kind of engagement. I will say one caution, and I just want to be very realistic. Universal Periodic Review does not provide sanctions or punishments for state violations of Indigenous rights. Universal Periodic Review is about giving recommendations for states to change their behavior, and it's about engagement with states to help them change their behavior. So I always tell or advise Indigenous organizations that we have to just manage our expectations about what is possible from Universal Periodic Review and recognize that it is part of much larger campaigns, much larger sets of strategies that we have to use. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. We heard also from the Special Rapporteur that many indigenous communities are also forcefully removed from their territories in the course of conservationism adaptation measures. Professor Eisma-Osorio, what does it mean also in the context for the kind of forced migration those communities are exposed to? To what extent are also national governments following a regional or international framework when doing so? What kind of legal remedies do those communities have? And what does it actually mean to create these kind of, almost I would call it, internally displaced indigenous communities?
We have strong, domestic laws, for instance, in the country, like the Indigenous Peoples Rights Act, which is revolutionary all over the world. But in terms of, the implementation and enforcement of this law, there's still a lot to be desired of. And so in terms of displacements of these communities, more often, there are no protection for these communities given by the governments under current domestic laws that we have. Internally displaced communities happen a lot when it comes to, because they're victims of natural disasters, they're victims of extreme climate change, adverse impacts of climate change, and aside from that, they're also victims of displacement because of mining companies coming into their ancestral lands and domains, and taking over their resources. While we have this national law protecting their rights, we still operate, our legal system still operate with the Regalian doctrine in mind that all natural resources are owned by the state. So unfortunately, the government or the state allows large-scale utilization of our mineral resources, since these are in the form of investments. They see it as investments that comes into the country, and not, even if we have some processes that are in place, like getting their prior informed consent, before government and the private investor can come in. Sometimes these processes are sometimes not strictly observed, and you could see that the consent of communities are sometimes given just because they lack the information, they lack the capacity to understand what the consequences are for this mining contract. So for legal remedies, we try to always seek to address their rights, and we have legal remedies that are in place that can seek for. We have rules of procedure for environmental cases, for instance, that allows these communities to have to assert their rights to a healthy environment, while trying to also address the environmental damage that are caused by these activities. So but the key is that you have to provide those assistance in a timely manner, because of course everything sometimes happens so fast, and before you know it, communities are already asked to forcibly relocate, or and are dislocated by these government programs. So by their very nature, it is important to provide timely and effective legal remedies to these communities. And yeah, it's a lot of work, but we need to look at how we can change the current policy framework to provide more protection of the rights. We need a lot of laws that needs to be amended so that we can protect their rights.
Okay, thank you. Certainly, forced migration is the kind of most severe scenario, but there are other climate change-induced burdens for the communities. Guadalupe, to what extent, and if perhaps it's a question to you, Guadalupe, and to Cheyenne, to what extent does this also change the social fabric of your indigenous communities, the identity, particularly also when young people are then perhaps voluntarily migrating because they can't see any perspectives anymore, because their livelihood gets succeedingly destroyed. What can we see in terms of cultural identity, also harm to the social fabric of the communities? Do you want to, who wants to come first, Guadalupe or Cheyenne?
Guadalupe, you can go first.
Okay, Guadalupe.
Bien, ¿procedo? Okay. Bien, sí, me parece que la doctora Osorio hizo hincapié en esta cuestión tan importante que es la migración como producto de estas dinámicas dentro de las propias comunidades, ¿no? Y va a ser precisamente estas dinámicas de migración causadas en mucho por este cambio climático lo que va a llevar poco a poco a la pérdida de identidad. Hay pérdida de identidad de los pueblos. Hay porque se trastocan, por ejemplo, las formas de organización para los ciclos agrícolas. Se pierde la lengua, se pierde la vestimenta, se cambian los patrones de consumo, la sustitución de alimentos, pero también se cambia o se influye, se impacta mucho en las formas de apropiación del espacio. Y estas formas de apropiación del espacio van a trastocar de igual manera o profundamente dentro de la cosmovisión. Creo que sí es un elemento muy importante verlo desde estas migraciones, desde la migración, particularmente desde la migración forzada en nuestras comunidades, ya por la minería, ya por los megaproyectos eólicos, ya por las hidroeléctricas, y son cada vez más frecuentes, ¿no? Y esto es así porque muchas veces dentro de estos elementos o dentro de estos proyectos, pues la situación se torna compleja dentro de las propias comunidades. Estos mismos proyectos causan problemas, causan divisiones, rompen tejido social, crean bandos, digamos, confrontados a causa de la apropiación de los recursos, a causa también de cómo construyen esa idea del desarrollo desde el interior a partir de un proyecto. ¿Quiénes se oponen? ¿Quiénes no se oponen? Entonces creo que sí cambia la identidad, rompe tejido social, trastoca la vida comunitaria, pero creo que también ahí los y las jóvenes tienen un papel muy importante que jugar, y creo que también se ha tratado de revalorizar desde el interior de las comunidades estos saberes, ¿no? Los propios saberes desde el interior. Y bueno, los jóvenes están tratando de ser más activos, más propositivos, participar más en los proyectos dentro del ámbito comunitario, asumir cargos, asumir espacios de toma de decisión, involucrarse, proponer con la educación, proponer programas, pero también una cosa muy importante que se ha dado, las mismas condiciones lo han creado, es esta parte que ya decía Shianne hace rato, la formación que se va adquiriendo desde lo profesional, y muchas veces implica un compromiso para los jóvenes el formarse fuera, pero regresar a aplicar el conocimiento dentro de sus comunidades. Entonces, creo que es una forma un poco pequeña o muy interesante también de tratar de construir tejido social desde otra, una visión, digamos, complementaria, una visión inclusiva, ¿no? Que pudiera a nosotros permitirnos conservar desde las comunidades los patrones, los conocimientos, pero al mismo tiempo saber y atender las demandas de pues, un mundo cada vez más que interactúa más, ¿no?
Thank you, Guadalupe. Cheyenne, what are your experiences with the First Nations in Canada when it comes to the impact of migration?
Thanks. And I just wanted to add on to that, that I've seen it happen here in Manitoba where whole communities have been displaced due to flooding and they're taken from their communities and their whole life is just washed away. And then you fast forward even 7 years later, they're still having to deal with the reclamation of their own lands on their own and find their own funding and resources to help the land become healthy again, to grow food. So I think our governments can do a better job of providing supports to communities. I know that they help rebuild communities, especially in the Interlake region, where communities have had to, their whole community got washed away and they had to build new communities. But in cases like that, yeah, I think that they can do a better job, like at the time of the occurrence, that there are resources and supports available where they have like emergency rations that they can deal with the problem right away in the community. But also if they do have to migrate, that they have supports waiting for them and it's all organized already, that they're not waiting around, waiting on food rations or how they're going to, where they're going to stay and having confusion happen in a community. And that's where climate change, like adaptation planning comes into play, because communities go through a process and they work through it to understand where they are vulnerable and where the opportunities are and what action steps they can take to mitigate the effects of climate change in their community, because each community is specific. So the plan itself is specific to the specific community to help them through these times. And education and training, as you mentioned, can be built into that, as well as mental health supports, cultural support, ceremony support, so that you're not feeling that disconnect to identity if you have to leave your community and you have to migrate. And also when we talk about migration, I think about migration in terms of that if there's a forest fire or a flood in the area and you have to move, then you're not having access to your fishing and your hunting. It is impacting your rights in that way. And then you're kind of bound by the rights of the region where you are. So for another example, in my area here in southern Manitoba, there's a moratorium on moose hunting, but yet moose is a staple for our people. And they say that we've overhunted the moose, but it's due to climate change, that they've migrated, the moose themselves have migrated to another province, but we can't go. So we have to travel further and go to a different province to go hunting. And that's a part of our rights as well. So I think acknowledging those types of rights when you're crossing boundaries. I don't know if you've dealt with that kind of scenario. So I see migration kind of in those two facets, and that there could be an increase of like supports for hunters and trappers and supplies and equipment, fuel. Our fuel cost is insane right now, as everybody knows. So even just having that extra support on how the community can get access to healthy traditional foods and berries and medicines, I think that's a pathway forward as well.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you very much, Cheyenne. I would like to bring into our discussion one question from the audience, actually from my colleague, Christina, who's running the program on political participation. And therefore, it's also one of her concerns. What are, from your own experience, also on the best practice side, what are the most effective political channels that Indigenous women can use in order to make their voices heard? We heard already the kind of women associations, etc., but to what extent are there consultative processes, or what kind of channels, be it joining political parties, etc. What would you recommend to my colleague? Because I can also assume that she asked this question about where should the program perhaps place an emphasis, a focus on when trying to capacitate women, Indigenous women? Now that's a question to all of you, so please come in. Who would like to come first? Guadalupe?
Gracias.
Go ahead.
Sí, creo que los espacios como mujeres inician sí en la comunidad, porque muchas veces son las mujeres las que se organizan para las protestas. Por ejemplo, se han visto muchos casos aquí en México, Oaxaca en particular, en donde las mujeres se van a organizar para las protestas, para hacer frente a la defensa del agua, para hacer frente a la defensa del bosque, para hacer frente a la biopiratería. Entonces, como primera instancia, se tiene la asamblea o las formas de organización internas comunitarias, los grupos de mujeres, las alianzas, muchas veces con organizaciones de la sociedad civil, las alianzas con instancias internacionales, ¿no? Grupos de expertos, fundaciones, y en particular, en el caso lo hablo así porque quiero comentar que en el caso de Oaxaca, por ejemplo, hay otros estados más en México, pero en el caso de Oaxaca, al regirse bajo sus propios sistemas, no recurren en lo local a los partidos políticos. Y en alguna forma hay un desencanto hacia lo político institucional, hacia los partidos políticos, que llegan a ser un mecanismo o un mecanismo a través del cual pudieran hacer sus demandas, sí, pero muchas veces gana ese desencanto porque los propios partidos políticos no incluyen población indígena o solo en teoría. Entonces, esa es una gran limitante también, ¿no? Dentro del escenario político formal, digamos, llega a ser una limitante. Decían unas compañeras, mujeres indígenas en defensa del agua, dice que hay muchas formas de hacer política. Desde nuestras comunidades hacemos política, defendiendo el agua hacemos política, protestando hacemos política. Yo pregunto, decía una de ellas, ¿cómo quieren que hagamos política? Nosotros la estamos haciendo. ¿Quieren que la hagamos como ustedes ahora? A través de partidos, a través de instituciones. Y yo creo que, en lo particular, creo que sí son formas que se entrelazan. Y de esa manera creo que las opciones son de igual manera, una vez fortalecidos, o fortalecernos viéndonos, pero también viendo hacia afuera, ¿no? ¿Qué instancias tenemos para apoyarnos y para apoyar en este tránsito o en este combate al cambio climático, en la búsqueda de mayores espacios para mujeres indígenas y también de la participación política, ¿no? Entonces, sí iniciamos con la vida comunitaria, hay organizaciones, hay fundaciones allá afuera y en algún momento partidos políticos. Gracias.
Thank you. Are there opinions on the most effective political channels that Indigenous women could use to make their voices heard?
I could share.
Yes, please.
I was just thinking about political channels, and in Canada, I see that the political channels kind of happen based on public opinion, and I'm seeing a lot of movement, especially in the area of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and how that started off as like a grassroots movement that spread out across the country, and it led to a policy change and calls to action. Similar with Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the calls to action, like it came from the people that were wanting this. And I feel that it's up to our leaders in the communities, whether that be for us, the reserves are governed by chief and council. So usually one chief and 4 to 5 council members, but they're only on either 2-year terms or 4-year terms. So they're limited in about how much engagement they could have because they have these smaller terms. But it's up to them to lobby the ministers of Canada to implement change and to speak on behalf of the people. So really it all comes down to what the people want. And that's how you can get your voices heard. So if there was a group of women that were pushing for more rights for climate change, and starting at the grassroots level, that would grow. And then you'd have your leaders speak on behalf of you to the minister, because a lot of the action that happens in Canada is based on ministerial mandates. So that's just like a few of the different ways that you can implement change, but ultimately it comes from what the people want. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please, Lisa.
Yeah, I would like to share the experience in the Philippines where I think the most effective channel would be at the local government level. And we have created a mechanism where there would be mandatory local representation from Indigenous Peoples community that can sit in the local councils. And so aside from, the political, leaders that we are elected during national and local elections, local Indigenous communities can choose their representative that can sit in the council and where local decisions are made with respect to, the rights and whatever issues that they're facing can be also addressed by the local government. So this is effective because we have a highly decentralized form of government. As you know, the Philippines is very decentralized because we're in an archipelago. So and most of the key decisions should be made at the local level because everything the challenges and all the other issues are actually happening at the local level. So the first responders for these challenges is actually the local government leaders. And so having those local representatives sit in the local councils where policies are made are an effective channel, I think, for the voices of these communities to be heard at that platform.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to skip in here, Jonathan, or perhaps in the next question?
Yeah, I'll provide a transition between this and then the question from Jesus that is in the chat space. So I think what I've witnessed, and this is within my own people and even my own family, I'll make note of this, that so my family is from a region of Shianne State in Myanmar, and it's a complex environment with more than 36 different indigenous groups cohabiting the same space. And you can see the lake that is the feature of our area in Town G in Shianne State. The women are very proactive, and they've been very assertive in trying to organize their own professional associations. They start their own businesses. They try to promote the idea of Indigenous women having an active role in the economy, also in politics. And they are trying to change the patriarchal culture. So they're changing their own culture, but they're trying to do so in a way that's very, that's not disruptive. They're trying to preserve their cultural identity, but still assist it in trying to promote the rights of women. The challenge, though, is that they want more than representation. And what's happening in so many places, not just in Myanmar, but I think in many countries, is that there are many government mechanisms, local government mechanisms, the question that Jesus is raising, and they allow representation, but it's not meaningful. I use the term, it's not substantive representation. So what I mean is there are Indigenous people who are attending a meeting or Indigenous women who attend a meeting, but they only are there as symbols. No one listens to them. or they are separated into a separate room at a separate time. And these kinds of things do not present real participation. They do not provide real engagement. And so to encourage respect for and promotion of Indigenous rights, to allow Indigenous women in particular to have more influence at the local, national, or international level, there has to be attention to engagement that actually allows them to influence the decisions of meetings, to influence the decisions of different government mechanisms. And it's more than just representation. It's more than just attendance. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I actually would like to take up the question of Jesus and on the significance of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, also when hopefully also the Special Rapporteur is joining us again. And I hope that we get a kind of a signal from his office. Raquel, perhaps let us know when he's ready to join us again, because I think that would be also interesting to hear his opinion on. But perhaps I just go on in our conversation, and I would like to stick with you, Jonathan, in a context such as Latin America or First Nations, in Canada. We talk about Indigenous rights in mostly democratic systems. But even there, you face serious obstacles. You have, particularly because of your own background, but also in your research, you have focused on Myanmar and other countries in the region, where also the regimes are non-democratic. So how can Indigenous rights be protected in autocratic settings where even the environment is less favorable?
So thanks for that question. The news is complicated, and the answer is it's not easy. So I'll note that with autocratic states or authoritarian states, number one, they want to centralize control. They want to centralize power in a specific person or within a capital city. And then number two, they don't follow rule of law. Instead, they exercise something called rule by law, where the law is an instrument to increase power. So they don't want to share power at all. So those two factors create a special challenge for Indigenous peoples. The notion of Indigenous rights, especially with the Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it involves the right of self-determination, the right of autonomy, the right to control your own status, political status, legal status, social status, the rights of Indigenous peoples to determine or decide for themselves what they want and what they want to do. That right of self-determination is a direct challenge to authoritarian power. It's a direct challenge to authoritarian desires for centralization of power and for rule by law. Right? The challenge that, or the effort that is happening, I think, in many countries right now, particularly those with authoritarian systems, is there is a negotiation between the Indigenous rights movements with the authoritarian government. And the negotiation usually is about trying to show that Indigenous rights to self-determination do not challenge authoritarian power. They do not violate state sovereignty. They do not threaten the power of states to have jurisdiction or control over population, territory, resources. But as you can imagine, this is a very difficult argument or very difficult discussion for many countries to have. This is why the instruments like the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples become very important. They provide a set of standards. So, we use the legal term norms, standards about what is appropriate or not appropriate. And things like the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples indicate that there are international norms or international standards about the relationship between indigenous peoples and all governments, all states, so including authoritarian regimes. And that helps the discussions to try and change state behavior and encourages or promotes discussions, even on authoritarian systems, about the possibility of authoritarian governments recognizing and engaging with and working with indigenous peoples. But you are correct. It is a very difficult process. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to ask again, Raquel Hernandez, I hope she's listening to our discussion, whether she could give us a signal whether the ambassador is rejoining us, because we are coming to the end of our discussion. But I have one last question also to Cheyenne, because Guadalupe also highlighted the importance of building alliances. And alliances not only nationally, but also in the region, but also going beyond, and to work across sectors. And in a way, we also try to do this today with a kind of format we have chosen that also tries to reflect this kind of multi-stakeholder approach, where you bring also together academia, representative of indigenous communities, advocates, but also then the UN as an actor. But I also have to admit, in this context, I missed out on an important stakeholder, which would be the kind of representative of a government, of a political party, a parliamentarian. But nevertheless, if you look at also the kind of experiences from your own work, what kind of initiatives are needed? And we have legal frameworks, we have a UN declaration, but evidently this is not enough also to create the awareness within the communities, but also beyond and in the broader public. So what would be your recommendation? How could we enhance the cooperation across the sectors, but also beyond national boundaries?
So I think the example that I gave earlier from the Canadian Institute of Climate Choices was a good one, because they have Indigenous representation at their board level, the expert panel level, at the advisory panel level, and also now there's more support for researchers to submit research that is specific to Indigenous communities. And as I mentioned, majority of those researchers are women. And in their research, they are able to provide recommendations for climate policy and what can change and how can you do climate policy better in Canada. So I feel that that's a way that we can amplify voices through research, because the research that is submitted is reviewed and highly regarded and incorporated into different conversations that are happening and different products that are coming out of the Institute. And that is getting federally recognized, and the information is getting out to the public. So I feel by having more opportunities like that and more opportunities to have women's voices amplified would really benefit. Just even getting the stories heard, the best practices, the success stories, creating forums where women can gather and talk about best practices and what works for their communities or what doesn't work, where the changes need to happen. I think having this dialogue needs to happen and should happen. It should have happened a long time ago. I know there's all these circles that are happening in a regional space where women are coming together, like having water gatherings. I know that there's through the Turtle Lodge in Manitoba, they host water gatherings where they bring women together and they just talk about their perspectives on water. But what if there was something like that internationally, where you talked about why is it important? How do we restore those matriarch relationships and our cultural ancestral rights to water and our relationship to, and how does that impact climate change, and what are the opportunities? How can we save this knowledge for future generations? I think that dialogue and that conversation does need to happen. It needs to start somewhere. This is a really good start. It's the first time I've ever seen anything like this. So I was really excited to participate. So thank you for allowing me to speak today.
Thank you, all of you for joining us. That was an extremely rich debate, and we have touched on so many different issues, but all related to the rights of Indigenous women in the context of climate change. And I hope that also our program that is really dedicated to the political participation of Indigenous communities also perhaps can benefit a little bit from the kind of ideas, recommendations, and best practices you have shared with us. I'm really sorry that our UN Special Rapporteur, Ambassador Cali Tzay, has not been able to return. Apologies, I know he wanted to be with us, but I'm pretty sure he has been caught up in different in another forum. So thanks to all our panelists. Thank you very much to our audience, and hopefully we can continue the discussion in a different setting. And I wish you a very good rest of the day, a very good night to Lisa in the Philippines. Thank you.
Miigwech, thank you.
Thank you. Salamat.